In the autumn of 1943, American engineers took apart a captured German staff car in a quiet workshop somewhere in the United States. It was smooth, elegant, painted desert tan, designed by Ferdinand Porsche himself. They measured every bolt. They ran it through mud, sand, and water. Then they compared it, part for part, against a small, square, painfully simple truck that American soldiers had already started calling the Jeep. What they wrote down in a restricted military handbook 2 years later would have embarrassed the German army, if the German army had not already reached the same conclusion on its own. German soldiers who captured American Jeeps in the desert, in Sicily, in France, did not destroy them. They did not abandon them. They stole them, repainted them, and fought to keep them. One of Adolf Hitler's most famous commandos would later build his most daring operation of the entire war around a shopping list that began with 100 American Jeeps. He never even asked for their tanks. This is the story of a truck nobody in the United States Army thought it needed, until it turned out to be one of 4 pieces of equipment that Dwight Eisenhower himself credited with winning the war in Europe. None of them, he said, was ever built to fight. Before we dive in, get comfortable and grab your favorite warm drink. Now, check the time. What does your clock say right now? Leave it in the comments, and let's step back into World War II together. In the summer of 1939, the United States Army held the largest peacetime military exercise in the history of the country up to that date, in the fields around Plattsburgh, New York. 52,000 soldiers took part. There were mock attacks, simulated artillery barrages, columns of horses and motorcycles trying to move through dirt roads that had turned, after a week of rain, into something closer to soup than earth. It was not working. The horses were slow, and they ate more than the quartermasters could easily supply. The motorcycles tipped over in the mud and broke the legs of the men riding them. The Model T Fords the Army still used as staff cars, unchanged in their basic design since the First World War, sank to their axles the moment they left a paved road. An army built to fight a modern war could not move faster than a man could walk, once the weather turned against it. Umpires walking the exercise grounds wrote in their after-action reports of columns stalled for hours behind a single mired truck, of runners sent on foot because no vehicle could reach a forward command post in time, of officers standing in ankle-deep mud watching a war game slip away from them, not because of enemy fire, but because of weather any farmer in the region could have predicted. One officer watched these maneuvers with more alarm than most. His name was George Catlett Marshall, 58 years old, a graduate of the Virginia Military Institute who had spent 1918 in the mud of France, watching messages arrive too late and reinforcements arrive later still. On the 1st of September of that same year, the day German tanks crossed into Poland, Marshall took the oath of office as the new Chief of Staff of the United States Army. He had spent years arguing, quietly and without much success, that the Army needed something new. Not a tank, not a truck, but a small, light, four-wheel drive scout vehicle that could go where a horse would break its leg and where a motorcycle would simply fall over. Congress had not been interested. Now Poland was burning, and Marshall understood that whatever he was going to do about it, he would have to do it fast. He remembered France in 1918 with a clarity that never seemed to fade. The smell of wet wool and gun oil, the exhausted horses standing in flooded gun pits, the couriers who arrived hours after the information they carried had already stopped mattering. He did not intend to fight the next war the same way. He did not have to wait long. France fell in June of 1940, and 2 weeks later, on the 11th of July, the United States Army Quartermaster Corps mailed a set of specifications to 135 American automobile manufacturers. The document was almost cruel in what it demanded. A four-wheel drive vehicle weighing no more than 1,300 pounds empty, carrying a payload of 660 pounds, built on a wheelbase of 75 inches, with an engine strong enough to produce at least 85 foot-pounds of torque, a folding windshield, a top speed of at least 50 miles an hour, and a low crawl speed of 3. Bids were due in 11 days. A finished running prototype was due in 49. Most of the 135 companies read the letter and threw it away. The timeline was considered a bad joke inside the American auto industry. Only 2 firms answered the original call. One was Willys Overland of Toledo, Ohio, a company that knew engines. The other was a small, nearly bankrupt firm in Butler, Pennsylvania, called the American Bantam Car Company, which had spent the previous decade building tiny economy cars nobody wanted and had already laid off most of its engineering staff because it could no longer pay them. Ford would join the competition a little later, after the Army invited them in directly. Bantam had 11 days to submit blueprints, supplier lists, and a full cost breakdown, and 49 days after that to hand over a vehicle that actually ran. It had no engineers left on staff. What it had was a telephone number belonging to a freelance engineer in Detroit named Carl Probst. Probst was 56 years old, the son of a country doctor from Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and he had been designing automobiles in one form or another since before the First World War. When Bantam called him, he said no. He was between jobs, short on cash, and not eager to gamble his time on a company that looked like it was already dying. Bantam pleaded again. Probst still said no. It took a phone call from William Knudsen, recently pulled from the presidency of General Motors to run Army procurement, telling Probst directly that his country needed him, before the engineer finally got in his car and started driving east. He arrived at Bantam's nearly empty drafting room on the 17th of July 1940, with less than a week before bids were due. He worked through Wednesday night by the light of a single desk lamp, sketching axle placements and frame dimensions on paper, still warm from the drafting table, stopping only for black coffee poured by whichever Bantam employee happened to still be in the building. He worked through Thursday the same way, barely leaving the drafting room, arguing quietly with himself over torque figures and ground clearance, while the rest of the nearly empty plant sat silent around him. By Friday afternoon, the 19th of July, he had finished the basic layout of a vehicle that did not yet have a name. He took Friday evening off to see a movie, then spent the weekend finishing the cost calculations and the supplier specifications. On Monday morning, the 22nd of July, he and Bantam's plant manager loaded the paperwork into a car and drove it to the Quartermaster Test Center at Camp Holabird, on the edge of Baltimore. Probst had sketched the basic design of what would become the Jeep in 2 days and finished the entire bid package in 5. Nothing in the design was original by itself. The engine came from a small firm called Continental. The transfer case came from Spicer. The transmission came from Warner Gear. The axles were modified Studebaker units. What Probst had done was something nobody else in that room had managed in 11 days. He had taken parts that already existed, sitting on shelves in ordinary American factories, and arranged them into the exact machine the Army had been asking for since the days of Marshall's quiet arguments in the 1930s. On the 23rd of September, Bantam's finished prototype, driven because the company could not afford to ship it, covered the roughly 250 miles from Butler, Pennsylvania, to Camp Holabird under its own power. By multiple accounts from the men who were there, it rolled through the gate about 30 minutes before the deadline expired. What happened next was not fair, though it may have been necessary. The Army tested Bantam's prototype, put it through mud pits, steep grades, and water crossings, and declared it the best design it had seen. Then, worried that a company as small as Bantam could never build vehicles fast enough for a war that had not yet reached America, but clearly was coming, the Army handed Bantam's own blueprints to Willys Overland and to Ford and ordered them to build the same vehicle. The contract, the Army argued, meant the drawings now belonged to the government. Carl Probst was furious. There was nothing he could do about it. Willys and Ford then made the design better. Willys engineer Delmar Roos, known to everyone as Barney, had spent 2 years turning an old, tired 4-cylinder engine into something he called the Go Devil, a 60-horsepower unit that ran flat out on a test bench for 100 hours without failing, where its predecessor had broken down after 22. The Army insisted every manufacturer use it. Ford, in turn, contributed the small stamped steel grille with vertical slats that has been the visual signature of the Jeep ever since. By July of 1941, the design was standardized. Willys built it as the Model MB. Ford built the identical vehicle, interchangeable down to the last bolt, as the GPW, the W standing for Willys, because Ford was now building someone else's licensed design. By the time the war ended, the two companies had built roughly 647,000 of them between them. Bantam, the company that had actually invented it, built 2,675 before being pushed aside entirely and survived the rest of the war-building trailers for the vehicle it had designed and would never be allowed to mass produce. It declared bankruptcy in 1950 and was absorbed by a steel company 6 years later. In 1948, the Federal Trade Commission would finally rule that credit for the original design belonged to none of the big manufacturers, but to American Bantam. Karl Probst never grew rich from what he had drawn in a borrowed drafting room over a single terrible week. He died at his home in Dayton, Ohio, in August of 1963, largely forgotten outside a small circle of historians and collectors who understood exactly what he had done. But the strange little vehicle that 133 other companies had thought was impossible to build in 49 days was about to leave the drafting rooms of Ohio and Michigan behind and step onto a stretch of desert in North Africa, where it was about to become something nobody, not the Army, not Willys, not even Karl Probst himself, had quite planned for it to be. Bantam's engineers had built a scout vehicle to solve an American mud problem. What happened next would turn that same vehicle into one of the most feared weapons platforms of the North African desert, in the hands of a 26-year-old Scots Guards officer who was not supposed to have an army of his own at all. The first place the Jeep became something more than a truck was a stretch of desert in eastern Egypt in the summer of 1942. The Special Air Service was, at that point, a small and semi-official unit that barely existed on paper, founded the previous year by a Scots Guards officer named David Stirling. Stirling was 26 years old, tall, restless, and had been sent down from Trinity College, Cambridge, for an accumulation of minor offenses before the war gave him something serious to do with himself. He had nearly killed himself in an experimental parachute jump and had spent weeks recovering in a Cairo hospital bed, where, by his own later account, he first worked out the idea that would define the rest of his life. A handful of trained men, dropped or driven behind enemy lines, could destroy more enemy aircraft on the ground in a single night than the Royal Air Force could shoot down in the sky over weeks of fighting. For the first months, the SAS relied on the Long-Range Desert Group, a unit its own men nicknamed the Libyan Desert Taxi Service, to drive them close to their targets in heavy Chevrolet trucks. The soldiers would climb out, walk the rest of the way on foot, plant explosives on the parked aircraft, and walk back out under cover of darkness. It worked, but it was slow, and as German security around the airfields tightened through 1942, it grew more dangerous with every raid. Then, in the early summer of that year, Stirling's unit received its first small shipment of Jeeps. He looked at them and understood immediately that the quartermasters who had sent them had misunderstood what they were for. To Stirling, these were not transport. They were a weapon platform that had not yet been built. He had his men strip the vehicles down, cutting away windshields, bumpers, anything that added weight, without adding capability. He had them bolt on Vickers K aircraft machine guns, 4 to a vehicle, fed by Pan magazines holding 60 or 96 rounds each gun capable of firing between 950 and 1,200 rounds a minute. He packed the back of every Jeep with jerry cans of fuel and water, spare ammunition, and the small incendiary charges that SAS officer Jacques Lewis had perfected for setting parked aircraft on fire. On the night of the 26th of July, 1942, 18 of these modified jeeps, under Sterling's own command, crossed roughly 50 miles of open desert from a hidden forward base at the edge of the Katara Depression toward a German airfield called Sidi Hanesh. It was the field the Luftwaffe was using to stage the transport aircraft supplying Rommel's Afrika Korps, and without the fuel and ammunition those transports carried, Rommel's tanks could not move. For hours before the attack, the column crawled forward in near total silence. Engines kept low, drivers watching the stars rather than any instrument to hold their bearing across featureless open desert. The 18 jeeps drove onto the airfield in two columns, lights off, navigating by starlight, and when Sterling fired a green flare into the night sky, all 18 vehicles opened fire together, 72 machine guns raking the parked aircraft in formation as they drove the length of the field. Tracer rounds tore across the darkness in both directions as startled German ground crews scattered between burning fuselages, and the smell of aviation fuel and cordite hung over the runway long after the jeeps had already turned back into the night they had come from. In roughly 15 minutes, they destroyed or damaged around 37 enemy aircraft. They lost one man at the airfield itself, a 21-year-old Lance bombardier named John Robson, and one disabled jeep. The next morning, German dive bombers caught the retreating French detachment in the open desert and killed one of its men. The rest scattered into small groups and made their way back to base over the following days. In the 15 months between that raid and the night Sterling himself was finally captured in a Tunisian gully in January of 1943, the SAS destroyed more than 250 enemy aircraft on the ground across North Africa, along with fuel dumps, supply depots, and long stretches of telephone line, a total that by the regiment's own reckoning exceeded what the Royal Air Force managed to destroy on the ground across the same stretch of desert in the same period. Sterling spent the rest of the war as a prisoner, eventually ending up in Colditz Castle, but the tool he had turned into a weapon kept fighting without him. What the Germans were watching that summer, though they did not yet have a name for it, was a difference in philosophy rather than a difference in horsepower. It was not that Germany lacked small vehicles. It had the Kubelwagen, a Volkswagen variant designed by Ferdinand Porsche himself, elegant, comfortable, with an air-cooled rear engine producing roughly 24 or 25 horsepower. It had the amphibious Schwimmwagen, lighter and more compact than its American counterpart. But the Kubelwagen was, at its core, a passenger car pressed into uniform. It had rear-wheel drive only. Its engine, reliable as it was never designed to climb the grades or ford the water the Jeep was built for from the very first sketch. The Jeep had genuine four-wheel drive that a driver could engage without stopping, could ford close to 18 inches of water without any preparation at all, and far more with the waterproofing kits developed for amphibious landings. It could tow a trailer carrying nearly half its own weight, and its 60-horsepower Go Devil engine could run for days under full load without breaking down. Any soldier with a wrench and a basic mechanical mind could fix it in the field. The Kubelwagen asked more of its mechanics than most German units in the field could reliably give it. Its low, smooth belly pan, prized back home for keeping sand and dust out of the cabin, became a liability the moment the ground turned rough, catching on rocks and ruts that the Jeep's high, simple axles cleared without slowing down. Its rear engine placement, ideal for a peacetime commuter car, left it nose light and prone to losing traction on the exact kind of loose, sloping ground that made up most of the North African and Russian front. The Jeep, homely as it looked next to the Kubelwagen's swept, aerodynamic lines, had never been asked to be beautiful. It had only ever been asked to keep moving, and it did. American engineers eventually put this comparison in writing. In the autumn of 1943, they got their hands on a captured Kubelwagen, shipped back from North Africa, and tore it apart piece by piece, timing it on slopes, running it through sand and water. Their conclusion? Printed in a restricted War Department intelligence manual dated the 15th of March 1945, and titled The Handbook on German Military Forces, was blunt. The Volkswagen, the German equivalent of the American Jeep, is inferior in every way except in the comfort of its seating accommodations. Fewer than 1,000 copies of that handbook ever circulated, but the men who needed to read it, and the verdict stuck. What the handbook could not fully capture was the strangest part of the rivalry between the two vehicles, something German troops in the field had already been demonstrating for 2 years without needing a manual to tell them. When Wehrmacht units captured American jeeps in the Egyptian desert, in Sicily, in Italy, in France, they did not destroy them. They did not abandon them. They painted German crosses on the hoods and pressed them straight into service, so often and in such numbers that German vehicle inventories eventually had to be formally amended to account for them. A vehicle that German propaganda had publicly mocked as a toy built by an unserious country was at the same time being quietly stolen by German junior officers every chance they got. Behind all of this sat a much larger and much stranger gap. Germany had entered the war in 1939 with roughly 500,000 horses on its army rolls. That number grew substantially through the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, and by the final years of the war, as German factories buckled under Allied bombing, the Wehrmacht was leaning on well over 1,000,000 horses at any given time, more than it had used to invade Poland in the first place. Across the whole war, the German army used something close to 2.75 million horses and mules in total, more than it had used in the First World War. The image most people carry of the German army, tanks thundering across borders in a storm of mechanized fury, was true only of a narrow spearhead at the front edge of the force. Behind that edge, the bulk of the Wehrmacht still moved the way armies had moved since the Roman legions, on foot, with a horse pulling the supply wagon. The American Army of 1944 did not share that problem, because the American Army of 1944 had jeeps, and it had them everywhere. By the middle of the war, American factories were not simply building jeeps in large numbers, they were building them at a pace no other nation attempted to match for a light vehicle of any kind. At peak output, the Willys plant in Toledo could roll a finished jeep off the assembly line roughly once every 80 seconds, tested, fueled, and driven straight onto a rail car bound for a port on either coast. A single American infantry regiment was issued around 145 of them. A glider infantry regiment carried 24. A parachute infantry regiment carried 17, delivered by glider behind enemy lines, because there was no way yet to drop a vehicle that heavy under a parachute canopy. No other army in the war, British, French, or German, fielded anything close to that density of light, four-wheel drive transport at the regimental level. And what American soldiers did with each individual jeep once they had it was something the Wehrmacht of 1943 was simply not built to replicate. Welded steel brackets on the back turned an ordinary jeep into a stretcher carrier that could evacuate 2 wounded men under fire, with a third stretcher lashed across the hood in the worst moments. A pair of steel pipes bolted to the front turned it into a wire cutter that could slice clean through German telephone lines strung along the hedgerows of Normandy. Steel guide rails laid across the floor turned it into a rail maintenance vehicle capable of running along captured French train tracks. A pintle mount behind the rear seat turned it into a heavy machine gun platform for a Browning .50 caliber. A canvas frame turned it into a makeshift field ambulance. A front-mounted winch turned it into a recovery vehicle for trucks stuck in mud that would have swallowed anything heavier. On the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima, jeeps sank to their axles where trucks could not even get started, and the jeeps that stayed mobile still carried more wounded Marines off those beaches than the original medical evacuation plans had accounted for. Along the Lido Road in the China-Burma-India theater, jeeps hauled medical supplies and ammunition up jungle trails that British planners had already written off as impossible during the monsoon, where the only alternative was a man on foot with a stretcher and a very long walk. In the hedgerow country of Normandy, where thick earthen banks and tangled brush turned every field into a small fortress, jeeps towed improvised hedge-cutting devices welded from scrap German beach obstacles, letting infantry punch through country that had been designed, almost by accident, to swallow an advancing army whole. On the icy roads of the Ardennes in the winter of 1944, jeeps fitted with tire chains and rear-mounted machine guns ran messages and ammunition between isolated American positions during the German offensive, at a time when heavier trucks were sliding off the roads entirely. None of these modifications were designed in Detroit or Toledo. They were invented in the field by sergeants and corporals with welding torches, salvaged sheet metal, and the same practical mechanical instinct that had once turned Henry Ford's Model T into 100 different farm tools across the American Midwest a generation earlier. A soldier did not fill out a requisition form to cut 2 holes in a bumper and weld on a pair of pipes. He simply did it, tested it against the first stretch of German wire he found, and told the next unit down the road how he had done it. And within weeks, the same modification was showing up on Jeeps that had never been near the man who invented it. The most extreme version of that instinct was the airborne Jeep, stripped down, its windshield and bumper ends and hand grips removed, lashed with steel cable into the belly of a glider so it would fit through the narrow side door. British glider troops landed Jeeps this way at Arnhem in September of 1944, towing 6-pounder anti-tank guns into the streets, where the British 1st Airborne Division made its desperate stand at the bridge. American Jeeps rode into occupied Europe the same way with the 82nd and the 100 and 1st Airborne Divisions, and in Operation Varsity, the airborne crossing of the Rhine on the 24th of March, 1945, more than 200 Jeeps came in, with a single glider infantry regiment alone. Their crews jumped in by parachute. The Jeeps themselves rode in by glider, because there was still no way to drop something that heavy any other way. War correspondent Ernie Pyle, who rode in Jeeps from North Africa to Italy to France before he was killed by Japanese machine gun fire on the island of Ieshima in April of 1945, wrote about the vehicle in a dispatch from North Africa in June of 1943, later collected in his book, Here Is Your War. And the Jeep, good Lord, he wrote, I don't think we could continue the war without the Jeep. It does everything. It goes everywhere. It's as faithful as a dog, as strong as a mule, and as agile as a goat. It constantly carries twice what it was designed for, and still keeps on going. That is the part the Wehrmacht of 1943 had no framework for translating. Not the 4-wheel drive, not the field repairs, not even the glider deliveries. The fact that the men driving the Jeep were, in effect, redesigning it every single day in every theater, without waiting for permission from anyone above them. The German army was an institution that prized engineering excellence, handed down from above, the kind of thinking that produced the Tiger tank, a masterpiece of metallurgy and gunnery, designed by men with doctorates in offices far from any battlefield. The American Army was, in equipment terms, a far less elegant institution, but it ran on a culture where the man holding the wrench was assumed to know something the man holding the blueprint did not, and where improvising on official equipment was not a violation of the rules. It was the entire point of issuing the equipment in the first place. A German staff officer inspecting a captured American motor pool might have found the site faintly undisciplined. Jeeps with mismatched parts scavenged from 3 different wrecks, hand-painted unit markings, tools lashed to the frame wherever there was room, nothing like the uniform, cataloged perfect rows of vehicles a Wehrmacht quartermaster expected to see. But every one of those mismatched Jeeps ran, and kept running, and that was the only standard that actually mattered once the shooting started. By the autumn of 1944, the Jeep had become something close to a universal fixture of the Allied war effort. General George Patton rode in one across France. General Dwight Eisenhower was photographed in one in Normandy in the famous Signal Corps pictures that ran in newspapers back home. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery kept one alongside his staff car in the field. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the eldest son of the former president, drove through the Normandy fighting in a battered jeep he had named after his father's old volunteer cavalry regiment, until he died of a heart attack near a French village in July of 1944. Roughly 50,000 jeeps were shipped to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease, where Russian troops called them Vilises, and used them as command vehicles for officers all the way into the ruins of Berlin. King George VI, who came ashore on an amphibious vehicle to visit the Normandy beachhead 10 days after the initial landings, was photographed standing beside one during his tour of the front, a small, unglamorous truck sharing the frame with a monarch in a way no piece of military equipment ever quite had before. It was, by that point in the war, no longer a curiosity. It was simply how officers of every rank in every army fighting alongside the Americans expected to move. It is worth pausing on the medical role longest of all, because it is the role that the men who actually served alongside the Jeep remembered first, decades later, whenever anyone asked them about the war. Standard battlefield ambulance trucks could not reach the forward foxholes where men were actually being hit. Jeeps could. They drove through artillery fire with red crosses painted onto canvas tarps, picked up men who had been wounded only minutes earlier, and bounced them back across torn, cratered ground to the battalion aid stations where a surgeon still had a chance to save them. The American rate of death from wounds fell from around 8% in the First World War to around 4% in the Second. That improvement came from many things together: sulfa drugs, blood plasma, penicillin from 1943 onward, forward surgical hospitals, and air evacuation. But fast casualty evacuation by jeep, from the actual point of injury to the first doctor who could treat it, was one of the foundations that whole chain of survival was built on. It was not a weapon in any conventional sense. It simply decided, over and over again, whether a wounded man lived long enough to reach one. Medics who served in the infantry divisions that fought their way across France and Germany often described the same scene in nearly identical words decades later: a jeep engine idling somewhere behind the tree line, a stretcher passed hand to hand across broken ground, a driver who had already made the same run a dozen times that day and would make it a dozen more before the sun went down, each trip a small, unglamorous gamble that the vehicle underneath him would keep running exactly when it needed to most. Somewhere behind every one of those statistics was a specific driver, a specific stretch of road, a specific night when the difference between a man living and a man dying was measured in the few minutes a jeep could save over a truck that could not have made the trip at all. Multiply that by every division, every theater, every month of a war that lasted nearly 4 years, and the picture that emerges is not of a single dramatic weapon winning a single dramatic battle. It is of a small, stubborn, endlessly adaptable machine, quietly multiplying the effectiveness of everything else the American Army owned, one short, desperate drive at a time. None of that would have meant anything to the German High Command back in 1942, watching David Sterling's raiders vanish back into the desert night after Sidi Hanesh. To them, the jeep was still a curiosity, a small enemy truck that happened to be useful for carrying machine guns. It would take 2 more years of losing captured examples to their own soldiers and one final desperate winter offensive before the German army fully understood exactly what it had been up against all along. In October of 1944, as he began planning his last major offensive of the war in the Ardennes forest, Adolf Hitler summoned an SS lieutenant colonel named Otto Skorzeny to his headquarters in East Prussia. Skorzeny had already received the public credit, not entirely deserved, for the glider raid that freed the deposed Italian leader Benito Mussolini from a mountaintop hotel the previous year, and Hitler now had a stranger and more delicate assignment for him. He wanted Skorzeny to assemble a brigade of English-speaking German soldiers, dress them in captured American uniforms, put them in captured American vehicles, and send them through American lines in the opening hours of the Ardennes attack to seize bridges over the Meuse River, cut telephone wires, and spread confusion behind the front. The cover name was Operation Greif, the German word for Griffin, Skorzeny submitted a shopping list to the German High Command that included captured tanks, armored cars, self-propelled guns, 100 American jeeps, and dozens of trucks and motorcycles, along with matching quantities of American uniforms and weapons. What actually arrived at his training camp fell far short of what he had asked for. He received only a small fraction of the jeeps on his list, a couple of Sherman tanks, only one of which actually ran, a handful of scout cars, and enough American trucks to make up part of the shortfall, with the rest of his convoy made up of ordinary German vehicles, repainted olive drab and stenciled with white stars. Fluent English speakers were harder to find than jeeps. Of roughly 2,500 volunteers screened for the operation, only a small handful spoke genuinely convincing American English, and Skorzeny himself later admitted in his memoir that the results were, in his own word, terrifying. But it is worth noticing what he chose to build his infiltration force around in the first place. He did not send his small commando teams through American lines in German Kubelwagens, the vehicle his own country was producing by the tens of thousands. He sent them through in captured American jeeps because he and his men understood exactly what the Americans had already learned 2 years earlier in the Egyptian desert. A jeep would go anywhere a German vehicle could not, and any American military policeman standing at a checkpoint would wave a jeep through without a second thought, in a way he would never wave through anything else. The operation itself was, in strictly tactical terms, a failure. Its psychological effect was something close to staggering. American sentries across the Ardennes front began stopping every jeep they did not personally recognize and quizzing the men inside on baseball statistics, state capitals, and the names of cartoon characters. General Omar Bradley himself was briefly detained after correctly naming the capital of Illinois, because the military policeman who stopped him mistakenly believed the answer was Chicago. General Eisenhower, once intelligence officers warned that Skorzeny's commandos might be hunting for him personally, was effectively confined to his own headquarters outside Paris for several days over the Christmas holiday of 1944. Checkpoints that had once waved vehicles through in seconds now held up entire convoys for minutes at a time. As sentries paused to ask each driver questions, no German intelligence officer could have coached a commando to answer convincingly. The name of a hometown baseball team, the words to a popular song, the kind of small, ordinary knowledge that only came from actually growing up American. A handful of German soldiers riding in stolen jeeps came closer to paralyzing the Allied chain of command that Christmas than entire German divisions managed with tanks and artillery over the same days. Roughly 18 of Skorzeny's men were caught wearing American uniforms and were executed by firing squad under the laws of war, most of them in the Belgian town of Henri-Chapelle before the end of December. Skorzeny himself survived the war, surrendered in May of 1945, and stood trial before an American military tribunal in Dachau in the summer of 1947. He was acquitted, in part on testimony from a former British Special Operations officer who admitted that Allied forces had themselves considered using enemy uniforms in the field. He lived for nearly 3 more decades afterward. The captured American Jeep, the one vehicle his own army could not build for itself, had been the operational heart of his most ambitious mission of the entire war. None of this proves, on its own, that the Jeep won the war. Plenty of other machines helped win it: the Sherman tank, the Liberator bomber, the humble Higgins landing craft, the Dakota transport plane. Each one moved some part of the Allied war machine in a way that genuinely mattered. What sets the Jeep apart is the verdict rendered on it, quietly and almost in passing, by the man who had commanded the entire Allied effort in Europe. In his 1948 memoir, Crusade in Europe, Dwight Eisenhower wrote that 4 pieces of equipment had come to be regarded by most senior officers as among the most vital to Allied success in Africa and in Europe: the bulldozer, the Jeep, the 2.5-ton truck, and the C-47 transport plane. Curiously enough, he added, none of these was designed for combat. That last line matters more than it first appears to. Starting in 1945, American Army historians interviewed the surviving senior officers of the defeated German Army in a program that produced roughly 2,500 manuscripts, now held at the National Archives, the largest single body of senior German military analysis of the war that exists anywhere. Asked why they had lost, those German generals blamed Hitler. They blamed the weather. They blamed Allied bombing. They blamed the sheer weight of Soviet numbers in the East. They rarely named the Jeep directly in their formal reports. They did not have to. They described its consequences instead, without always realizing that was what they were doing. The speed at which American units could shift their weight from one sector of the line to another. The depth to which American patrols could probe before German lines even detected them. The rate at which American wounded were found, moved, and treated. The relentless, uninterrupted pressure an American battalion could keep applying to a battered German position because its supply of ammunition, fuel, and fresh orders simply never stopped arriving. Every one of those advantages, on the ground, traced back to the same small four-wheel drive truck, moving faster than any German equivalent could match. The contrast in the end was a contrast of two philosophies rather than two engines. Germany had built the Kubelwagen as a finished object, clever, comfortable, and precisely tuned to do one narrow job very well, and had built roughly 50,000 of them across the entire war. The United States had built the Jeep as an unfinished object on purpose, simple enough to repair with a wrench, and open enough to be modified by whoever happened to be driving it that week, then built it by the hundreds of thousands, more than 12 times the number of its German rival. One design trusted a small circle of engineers to get everything right before the vehicle ever left the factory. The other trusted every soldier who climbed behind the wheel to fix whatever the engineers had gotten wrong, wherever he happened to be standing when he noticed it. Karl Probst, the freelance engineer who sketched the whole thing in a borrowed drafting room over 5 days in July of 1940, never saw his name properly attached to what he had built. The company that hired him, American Bantam, was pushed out of the contract it had won, fair and square, and never built another car after the war. David Sterling, who bolted machine guns onto a supply truck in the Egyptian desert and rewrote the rules of special operations forever, spent most of the war as a prisoner because of it. Ernie Pyle, who loved the Jeep more than any other piece of equipment in the entire American arsenal, was killed by a machine gun on a small Pacific island 4 months before the war in Europe even ended. Most of the roughly 647,000 Jeeps built during the war have long since been scrapped. The survivors now sell at auction for tens of thousands of dollars, to men whose grandfathers may well have driven one of them off a landing craft at Salerno, or Cherbourg, or Manila Bay, restored today with the same stamped steel grille Ford's engineers added almost as an afterthought, and the same simple 4-cylinder engine Barney Roos refused to let fail on his test bench, still turning over more than 8 decades later in garages that have never seen a battlefield. There is a quieter irony sitting underneath all of it, one that none of the generals interviewed after the war seemed to dwell on for long. The vehicle that did the most to win the war for the United States Army was designed not by the Army itself and not by any of its major contractors, but by a freelance engineer nobody in Detroit had wanted to hire, working for a company so broke it could not afford to ship its own prototype to the one test that would decide whether it survived. The Wehrmacht, for all its reputation for engineering brilliance, never produced anything close to an answer for it. Not because German engineers lacked the skill, but because the culture that employed them had never asked for a machine that ordinary soldiers were expected to redesign on their own. What the Wehrmacht did with the Jeep in the end says more than anything its generals ever wrote down for the record. They captured it. They repainted it with their own crosses. They built their most daring commando operation of the war around stolen examples of it, because they could not build anything that did the same job themselves. And the general who had commanded the armies that beat them, when he finally sat down years later to explain how the war in Europe had actually been won, placed a small, plain, 4-wheel drive truck on the same short list as a bomber, a bulldozer, and a cargo plane, and noted, almost as an afterthought, that none of them had ever been built to fight.